Hello, listeners. This is Kat. Welcome back to Put Your Hands Up Podfics. This will be the continuation of All For You. This will be Part 6, Day 11. When Nezu told them that he would like to delay his report on his meeting with All For One until the next day, All might have been prepared for the worst, what could possibly give Nezu pause, to the point that he needed time to process. More than anything, All Might just wanted to barge into the hospital and confront the bastard himself, but he knew that wouldn't help, even if a direct physical confrontation would help his sanity. Needless to say, All Might didn't sleep. He was too wired for that. Yet when he entered Nezu's office, the principal of UA looked... Well, he didn't look stressed. To be honest, it was hard to tell with Nezu. All Might sat on the couch next to a stiff Night-Eye and across from a fidgeting Gran. Nezu poured himself a cup of tea. "Would anyone else like some?" Nezu asked cheerfully. All Might shook his head. Night-Eye and Gran did the same. "A pity," Nezu said. He drank slowly. "I'm sure you're all quite curious to know what I found yesterday," Nezu said, setting aside his tea. "What's the report, Nezu?" All Might asked seriously. "Does direct action need to be taken? Is anyone at risk?" Nezu hummed. "Yes, direct action. It does need to be taken." The three men waited with bated breath. "I'm going to send him a meal," Nezu said cheerfully. Silence. All three of them stood up at the same time. "What?" "With all due respect, Principal Nezu, why? Why?" "It is a show of good faith to initiate negotiations," Nezu explained, completely unfazed. "You mean you didn't start negotiations yesterday?" Gran asked. "Then what was the hold-up for?" "All For One was not in a suitable state of mind to begin negotiations," Nezu said, "because his son was in a risky surgery for a congenital heart defect." Night-Eye's brows furrowed in thought, and he slowly pushed up his glasses. All Might paused. "Bullshit," Gran snarled. While it might be unbelievable that All For One's mental state might be compromised by something as simple as his son receiving surgery, there was no other way to interpret his actions, Nezu pointed out. "The bastard was probably acting it up. He's just trying to trick us," Gran roared. Toshinori slowly sat down. His gaze fell to his hand. He stared at the first joint of his thumb. He was inclined to agree with Gran, but... "Do you doubt my assessment, Sorihiko?" Nezu asked, his voice placid and impenetrable. The chill ran down Toshinori's spine. Gran took a deep breath. There was the sound of the couch creaking as he sat back down. "No," Gran admitted gruffly. "I just don't trust him." "Understandable," Nezu acquiesced cheerfully. "But it is worthwhile to consider the ramifications of forcing him to negotiate while compromised, whether or not it is an act. All For One is a clever man, and would likely be able to slip out of agreements made while he wasn't at full capacity, per se. He would be able to argue that because he was not in his right mind during negotiations, he is therefore not bound to any agreements made during that time." Gran grunted. "Which makes it best to wait." "Quite." "Even if we do wait," Gran said, "there's no way of knowing that monster will stick to any agreements. It's not like he has a record of doing anything other than what he wants." "True," Nezu said. "But All For One has already made an effort to start good-faith negotiations through his given information, which we all know to be true. Therefore, it is only logical we assume good faith and act in kind as well." Graham grumbled incoherently. "We will never make progress in this unique situation if we assume otherwise," Nezu pointed out. Gran sighed heavily. "Doesn't mean I have to be happy about it." Nezu squeaked a laugh, but said nothing in response. "Is the baby going to be okay?" Toshinori asked softly into the newfound silence. He felt all eyes turn to him. He kept his eyes on his thumb, his mind overlaying a tiny foot on it. He did not give a damn about how All For One felt, and Nezu's statement, and what it implied about the villain's status, made him deeply uncomfortable. But that baby had been so small. Could babies that small even survive surgery? "Heart surgeries in premature infants of low birth weight are extremely risky," Nezu said simply. "I have not requested a status update on Izuku post-surgery, which was yesterday, but there is every chance Izuku could have died in surgery or may die in the days soon after. Unfortunately, it is impossible to tell how okay he will be." Toshinori tried not to think of how small a coffin would have to be for a baby that size. He failed. The thought chilled him to his bones. "If what you say is true, and All For One's condition was truly that, compromised, because of the surgery for his son," Night-Eye said, "then I shudder to think of what would happen if he passed." The statement weighed heavily. "Unfortunately, there is nothing we can do about that," Nezu said softly. "That is up to the providers at the hospital." "If he's doing all this for that damn baby, it better not die," Gran grumbled. "The last thing I want to deal with is a grieving all for one." Toshinori shuddered at the thought. Hizashi owed this hospital his life. Now that Izuku had survived his first major surgery, his chances of coming home were much, much higher. He had passed his first hurdle with flying colors. Hizashi couldn't quite let himself dream about the future, but he was quite close to it. He still hadn't quite processed that the worst of Izuku's challenges were in the past yet. The feeling of intense relief that his baby, his son, his precious little Izuku, was okay had yet to pass. It welled up in him every time he looked at Izuku, and it took everything in him not to give in to the tears yet again. He had a reputation to uphold, after all, regardless of the fact that the staff of this hospital had seen him go 8 days with no sleep and live in borrowed scrubs because he couldn't bear to leave Izuku's side, and that he was ceasing all violent activity for his child, and that the nurses had started bringing him coffee and attempting to bully him to bed as he rounded on his 3rd day of no sleep, again, and that he was currently humming "You Are My Sunshine" to said infant child. Well, he could pretend he had a reputation to uphold. Hizashi looked over at his baby boy, wearing his little sunshine hat and partially covered with the baby blanket from Inko, and started humming the song over again. Izuku was still ventilated, and he still seemed so tired. He was still recovering from surgery, of course, and he would be for a while. He was barely visible underneath all the equipment keeping him alive, and the tiny patch of gauze on his chest hardly stood out amongst the many wires and tubes and monitors. But his color had never looked better. His lungs and heart function were on an upward swing. Hizashi had never been prouder, or more relieved. He desperately wished he could touch Izuku again, or even better, properly hold him, but his state was still fragile, and when it came to Izuku, Hizashi was nothing if not cautious. To be honest, he could probably hold Izuku's hand again, but he thought it better to wait, give him just a little longer to recover. He was sorely tempted to use one of his healing quirks on Izuku, especially now that his true identity was out in the open and he had nothing to hide. However, his healing quirks required energy from the person being healed, and Izuku had none to spare. It rankled him that he didn't have any that require energy from the quirk user to heal, but healing quirks were rare to begin with, and he'd had no incentive to search for a healing quirk that would be a detriment to him before Izuku came along. There was the option of giving Izuku a healing quirk as well, especially now that he actually had an injury that needed healing, but if he was wary of using a quirk on his son, would giving him one really be a good idea? It pained him, but he had a feeling it was not. He couldn't just sit there and do nothing either. Izuku had been stressed lately, and almost certainly in pain too, even with painkillers. He wanted his baby boy to know he was there, and he hoped that his presence was a comforting one. So he'd been humming old songs for him, simple, slow melodies that would let Izuku listen to his voice while not overwhelming him. Hizashi hardly remembered where he knew these songs from. They had likely accumulated in his memory over the years, or perhaps they were some bright fragment from a simpler time. It didn't really matter in the end. What did was whether Izuku liked it or not. Thankfully, he seemed to. His movements were slow, smooth, and relaxed, and his heartbeat was steady and calm. As he hummed, Hizashi reached down to grab a children's book from the tops of the stack that he had sitting next to his chair. He stared at the cover with a critical eye. He'd never really liked children's books, even as a child, and it seemed like the genre had hardly gotten more interesting. The staff told him that reading to Izuku would do him well, since it would let him listen to Hizashi's voice and increase his language skills later on down the road, hopefully. He still didn't really want to read them. 1 fish, 2 fish, red fish, blue fish hardly seemed like stimulating literature. Indulgently, Hizashi wondered if it would be inappropriate to read Izuku quirk theory. Now that was something interesting. Hizashi looked away from the book, his eyes resting on Izuku. He was lying on his back, his hands tucked near his face, and his legs curled up. His position kept with the help of position aids. His chest rose and fell in time with the ventilator. His eyes were closed most of the time, but Hizashi did sometimes see his eyes peek open to look around. Izuku had no understanding of what he was looking at. The only thing he knew how to differentiate was faces versus things that are not faces, and even then his understanding of what a human face looked like was likely rudimentary. He did not know how to count, what colors were. He did not know even a single word. So in a sense, Hizashi supposed 1 fish, 2 fish, red fish, blue fish was very advanced literature for Izuku, which meant he probably shouldn't try to get away with reading him the latest advances in quirk science. Hisashi stopped humming, letting out a sigh. "The things I do for you, Izuku," he said to himself, bending down to look at the stack of books to see if there was anything slightly more interesting than Dr. Seuss. Izuku jerked in his periphery. Hisashi stopped, his head jolting up to look at his son. Izuku's face was scrunched up, and he kicked out a leg unhappily. Hisashi sat back with a small laugh and set 1 fish, 2 fish, red fish, blue fish back on the stack. He went back to humming, and slowly but surely Izuku relaxed again. Seemed Izuku wasn't in the mood for Dr. Seuss either. All right, listeners, this concludes Day 11 of All For You. Day 12 will be next. I hope you all are still enjoying this fic, and as always, thank you so much for listening.